What if the last 80 years of world history were built on a totally different foundation? What if one single decision back in 1944 changed, well, pretty much everything we know about global power? Let's dive into that. Okay, just picture this for a second. You're planning that big trip you've been dreaming about, but your US dollars, they're not the magic key. To get that flight to Paris, you first have to swap your money for British pounds. A little bit of a hassle, right? Now, let's just blow that up to a global scale. Imagine entire countries doing this for every single major transaction. To fuel their economies, they actually need physical gold. To buy the latest technology, they've got to have a huge stash of French francs. I mean, the simple act of global trade suddenly becomes this ridiculously complex puzzle of currency swaps and constant risk. It would be a logistical nightmare. And that, right there, gets to the heart of what we're talking about. In this alternate reality, the United States is still a massive economic player, for sure. But it's not the default setting for global finance. It's one powerful country among several, not the sun that the entire financial system revolves around. So this is the big question, the one we're really going to dig into. How would the world, and America's place in it, be fundamentally different if the dollar had never reached this level of global supremacy? Okay, before we go too far down that rabbit hole, let's make sure we're on the same page. A reserve currency is basically the money that central banks all over the world trust and hold on to in huge amounts. You can think of it as the ultimate safe haven asset for the entire global economy. And listen, this isn't some abstract economic theory. This is super practical. Countries use these reserves to buy essentials like oil, to pay back loans they owe to other nations, and, critically, to defend their own currency's value when a crisis hits. It's really the financial bedrock of how countries deal with each other. And today, that bedrock is overwhelmingly American. The numbers are just, wow. Well over half of all global currency reserves are held in US dollars. No other currency is even in the same league. So that's the dominance we're questioning. But how did we even get here? The key moment was 1944. World War II is winding down. Europe is in ruins. Asia is devastated. But the United States, its industry is booming and totally dominant. So at the Bretton Woods Conference, 44 allied nations made what seemed like a very logical choice. They all agreed to peg their currencies to the stable, gold-backed US dollar. And just like that, the dollar-centric system was born, putting it at the very center of the financial universe. And this is the exact moment where our alternate history splits off. So here's our game plan. We're going to look at what a more fragmented financial world would be like. We'll ask if America could be a superpower without financial supremacy. We'll rethink the whole petrodollar system and see how global crises would play out. Then we'll check out the rise of other competitors. And finally, ask the big one. Is this hypothetical future actually starting to happen now? All right, first up, a fragmented financial world. If the dollar wasn't the king, what would have taken its place? Well, instead of one single dominant currency, the world would probably have several competing financial hubs. The British pound might have held on to its old imperial clout, maybe the French franc, or a system based entirely on gold. You could have even seen regional currency blocks pop up. So what's the result? A lot more friction. Global trade would be slower, it would be more expensive, all because of constant currency conversions and way higher risk. Okay, next section. Let's talk about America, superpower without supremacy. What would this kind of fragmented world mean for the United States itself? I mean, can you really be a military superpower if you don't have financial supremacy? You see, the dollar gives America something that's often called an exorbitant privilege. It really comes down to three huge advantages. First, the US gets to borrow money incredibly cheaply because everybody needs dollars. Second, it can use the dollar system as a weapon to enforce powerful sanctions basically cutting its rivals off from global finance. And third, there's this almost endless global demand for US government debt, which makes it super easy to finance, well, pretty much anything. Now, let's just take all of that away. In our alternate world, US interest rates would definitely be higher. That cheap borrowing? Gone. Financing government deficits, and by extension, a massive military budget, would suddenly become way more difficult. Economic sanctions would lose almost all their power. In Wall Street, the financial capital of the world, might not even be in New York. It could have stayed in London or maybe shifted to Zurich. Part 3, rethinking the petrodollar system. We have to talk about oil, because the connection between oil and the dollar is one of the biggest reasons for its dominance. Ever since the 1970s, oil has been priced almost exclusively in dollars. And this is huge. It means any country that wants to buy oil, which is basically every country, has to get US dollars first. This creates this massive, constant, artificial demand for the currency. So in our scenario, if oil was priced in gold, or maybe a basket of different currencies, the effect would be immediate. A massive source of the dollar's global power and America's leverage, which is poof, disappear. So let's move on to part 4, global crises, different rules. How would the world handle huge economic shocks, like the 2008 financial crisis, if the dollar wasn't the ultimate safety net? With dollar dominance, the U.S. Federal Reserve pretty much acted as the world's emergency banker in 2008. It pumped huge amounts of money into the system to stabilize banks everywhere. America could also run massive deficits to stimulate its own economy. But without that special status, printing trillions of dollars would cause its currency to lose value way faster, probably leading to crazy inflation and a total collapse in confidence. But here's the really interesting twist in all this. While America's ability to fight a crisis would be a lot weaker, the rest of the world would also be less exposed to America's problems. A financial crisis that starts in the US might not spread so fast or do so much damage because other economies wouldn't be so tightly linked to the American financial system. So where does all of this lead? To part 5, the rise of global competitors and how a truly multipolar world might have shown up a lot sooner. Without the US dollar's gravity holding everything in orbit, other powers might have emerged way faster. Maybe China's financial rise would have happened decades earlier. Perhaps European nations would have been forced to integrate their economies much more deeply and much more quickly. The end result? A world with 3 or 4 competing financial centers instead of just one big boss. Maybe that means more balance, or maybe it means more instability. History kind of shows us that these multipolar systems can be pretty fragile. And that brings us to our last section, and really why this whole thing isn't just a fun what if. Let's connect our little thought experiment to what's actually in the news today. Is this alternate future actually starting to happen? I mean, when you look around, you can see little echoes of our thought experiment everywhere. You've got the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, actively talking about alternatives to the dollar. China is pushing hard to settle more trade deals in its own currency, the yuan. The heavy use of U.S. sanctions is forcing countries to find ways around the dollar system, a process people are now calling de-dollarization. And then you have the total wildcard of digital currencies. The system is definitely being challenged from all sides. So our whole journey into an alternate past might actually be a sneak peek into a potential future. History teaches us that no single currency stays on top forever. So the question we're left with isn't just what the world would have looked like without the dollar's rule, but whether we're actually living through the very early stages of finding out.